Hi, everyone. I'm just going to take a few minutes to go over a little bit of change theory. I know all of you have learned about change theory, and I know a lot of you have both experienced change and also in many cases led different change processes. But just to bring us all on the same page, I'm going to talk about it a little bit here. And also I'm going to talk about the related but different concept, which is transformation. Change can often lead to transformation. Transformation can often lead to change. And I think often the best kind of change is one that is transformative. And certainly when we look at an educational perspective, that's what we often are gearing ourselves towards. So I'm going to start our talk today just with a little bit of a metaphor that I find, I think, really illuminating, and it is a poem. It's called There's a Hole in My Sidewalk, an autobiography in 5 short chapters. I bet many of you have heard this. And it was written by Portia Nelson. Chapter 1. I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. I think when you're thinking of that as a metaphor, that's pretty common. Do you know that feeling? Kaboom. You didn't see the hole. You fall in. You don't know how to get your way out. And finally, you make it out. Chapter 2. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I am in the same place, but it isn't my fault. It still takes me a long time to get out. Chapter 3, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it is there. I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5, I walk down another street. The idea of the process of change involving habits, what's familiar, our reflection on situations, the sort of games or tricks or thinking ploys that we use within ourselves in certain situations. That idea of, am I a victim of what's happening to me, or do I own what's happening to me? Things like that really play into the author's understanding of change within her life, in particular change within the context of something challenging or difficult happening, and also her capacity to make choice. And we see that in particular in chapter 5, I walk down a different street. So let's talk about change more generally. What is change? We know implicitly what that word means, but let's talk about how it's defined. So it's a process. Change isn't just a simple thing, move from A to move to B, move from doing something a certain way to another way, but it's a process. And the process involves altering something or replacing something. And I'm going to use an example in a minute. But and what we have to look at is what kinds of things are we altering or replacing? It could be knowledge. We're changing knowledge. Lots of us have experienced lots of different things over the course of our careers. Some common nursing ones. I remember when I was a new nursing student, and this sure dates me, that it was considered absolutely offensive to wear gloves when you're providing personal care, because that would imply to a patient that you think they are dirty. Skills change. How we do things changes. Absolutely, there is no question. And a great one is that we continue to insert Foley catheters, typically using sterile technique. And we've known for many years, decades, that actually clean technique is as effective as sterile technique. The problem is in clean technique, we actually have to provide absolutely pristine peri-care in order to do that. And if you think about it, patients catheterize themselves at home, don't they? When you may be a community nurse doing home care, patients who have long-term issues, are doing self-catheterizations. They're not opening a sterile tray to do that process. It's a clean technique. But we continue to follow the process that we know often until something tips us over, something forces a change. Changing attitudes is really important as well. How do we look at the world? How do we look at people? How do we look at healthcare? One of the areas that we see that is in terms of healthcare relationships. Do we see different members of the team in a hierarchical way? The physician has more power, other members of the team have more power or less power, things like that. Changing systems, how things work, who reports to whom, how things are funded. Changing policies, and that can be a really important one, because changing a policy cements that a change is happening, and changing procedures. And sort of, I talked about that a little bit when I talked about skills, but even with procedures, for example, and this could have a little bit of an impact on the element of procedures, but also on attitudes. In the old days, filling out an incident report was intended to sort of be a blaming thing, who gets the blame for what went wrong. Now with the patient safety agenda, it is absolutely not about blame. It is about preventing future error. So it is always about preventing future error, and if any additional education is required and other things for the people involved. But more, it's important that we create a common database and see if this is something that another person could benefit from. You will still see the old remnants of the blaming philosophy, partly because some nurses have carried it forward and some institutions have carried it forward, but the patient safety agenda is very clear that we should not be including that focus. And so I'm going to come back again to say, how do we then make a change? Ultimately, when we're looking about a change, we have to recognize that it's dynamic, and that means it's not just today we're going to change the way we do dressings, or today we're going to change the way we document, but it's dynamic. We have to look at a lot of factors. We have to determine, of all the alternatives, let's say we want to move to a different kind of documentation. Of all the alternatives, what is the best? What meets our needs, and who is involved? And recognize that this process often causes conflict and resistance. Can any of you think of a work situation where a change was brought in and you may not have been consulted in the way you wanted to have been, and you don't initially see the value in that change, or it seems like it's going to be a lot of work, or it seems like it may not benefit you or your patients, things like that. Change can also, though, lead to positive behaviors and positive attitudes, because change should be addressing an issue. If everything is going smoothly, there's no reason to bring about a change. If there's not a better alternative, there's no reason to bring about change. Change for change's sake is pointless. But change to bring about improvement is always our goal. And it should lead to improved employee outcomes. So better experience for you, you're able to do better work, and you're able to experience more satisfaction in your practice, and also improved organizational outcomes. So the hospital, let's say, or your community care center is able to save money. They're able to have better patient survival rates, or a time to discharge is shortened, or patients are able to express a decrease in, or an increase in positive perceptions of their stay. Let's take a second to talk about a really good exemplar, and we'll bring it through the next few examples of change theories. But most of you, if not all of you, have just been working through an incredibly chaotic, tumultuous time, right? So think of COVID-19, and in particular for a minute, we're going to talk about PPE. Now, I can't believe there's one of us who thinks this was a smooth transition, that we went 6 months ago or 7 months ago from thinking we only wore our masks once, that if a mask was contaminated, we disposed of it and we got another mask, and that we had a clear understanding of what kind of PPE was required in what situation, and the organization had that well documented, and we had posters that we could put up. And we could relatively well, not perfectly, but relatively well, predict when there would be situations where we may have an exposure. And in just these last 7 months, we've come to a point where we now are thinking, or 8 months, we don't necessarily know what is the best PPE. Now you could say there are procedures, and for sure there are. There are policies, for sure there are. But when you see all of the change that has happened over this period of time, it's hard to really know that we have a complete set of evidence that tells us how to keep ourselves safe. Doesn't that seem like a fair statement? We know what is best with the evidence we have today, but is that always going to be the best? And when we think of all of the changes that have happened over these months, it's hard to believe we're at the end of all that change. And so a situation like that can really jar us. You know, yesterday it was ridiculous to think that I should be wearing a gown and protective eyewear, goggles, when I go into a patient room, that all I needed to wear was gloves and a surgical mask. And now today I have to gown up as if I'm going into some kind of nuclear holocaust. So what's the difference? What have you learned overnight? And really, you didn't know that before? See how it's complicated, right? COVID is a great example of how change isn't just a simple thing that happens overnight. The world sort of changed overnight for us, but the time to collect all the evidence is happening right in front of us, right? Almost, it feels like slow motion, although it's a very short period of time. And so we have seen change after change after change, almost like a pinwheel. You know what a pinwheel is, that you put in your garden, your kids hold it, and it's got those little points, and when the wind catches it, it spins. And it's sort of like that for us. The wind catches one of those points and the pinwheel starts to spin and it slows down. Then another breeze comes and it spins again. Before it gets to slow down, another breeze comes and it spins. And soon it's just spinning and spinning and spinning. And that's kind of where we're finding ourselves. So let's talk about that within the context of change theory. Oh, before I get there, so why? And I alluded to this before. Change happens, not just for change's sake. Oh gosh, it's getting boring around here. Let's just change things up. That may be what I do in my house when I'm bored with the furniture or other things, but in a healthcare environment where people's lives and their dignity rest on our ability to do things well, we change because we're able to identify that there are problems or that we require changes in a variety of things. One of them is knowledge. We don't have enough knowledge, or new knowledge compels us to change. And think of COVID, new knowledge. When we discovered that it wasn't droplet necessarily, wasn't those large droplets, but actually it became airborne transmission that went much further and in much smaller particles than we had originally anticipated. We can identify problems with skills and have to move to new ways to do things because a skill is antiquated. And I'm going to give, again, a good example. Do you remember when we used to, for anyone who's old, certainly not as old as me, when I used to work with a nurse who was quite funny, but it's not funny in retrospect, who used to say, you have one chance, a patient is incontinent once in the emergency department, and that's it, Foley catheter goes in. We don't say that anymore. Now we say Foley catheter is an intervention of last resort. And in fact, in many hospitals across the United States, nursing students are never allowed to insert a Foley catheter. So we have nursing students in our baccalaureate program who are really disappointed that they don't have the opportunity to put a catheter in, whereas in the United States, the expectation is that's far too advanced a skill to have a student do it because of what we know about hospital-acquired UTIs, HATI, which is a leading cause of sepsis and death. Isn't that remarkable? And so it used to be something that a nurse could do so easily with their own judgment and just have an order to cover you. Of course, it's not, that's not the way things run, but now there is such conviction about the harm that that may cause. We change systems when systems aren't working, communication systems, things like that. Technology is a big one. As computer technology has changed, information system technology has changed. I'm sure many of you have experienced changes in documentation systems, right? And although the outcome may be great, it doesn't mean that it's not hard to go through that process. Has anyone struggled to learn a system that may not feel initially intuitive? Also changes in management or leadership. And that's so important to recognize, that when the leadership model is not working and there are gaps or there's dissatisfaction with it, or when when leadership seems to be okay, but the situations arise in such a way that it highlights where there can be improvement. So that continuous quality improvement happens. Also important to recognize that changes can happen in a variety of ways. They can happen locally. So for example, just on your unit or on your shift, how things are done right in a local environment, your unit. They can happen institutionally, a change in policy across an entire hospital or community agency. They can happen regionally, and you look at Ontario and the kinds of implementation of COVID protocols and things like that. Changes can happen nationally, and we see that through various Government of Canada organizations, Public Health Agencies of Canada, and other thing where we have regulation, and you might see big changes that happen. A good example is the change to Canada's food guide recently to make it much more accessible, the knowledge much more accessible, and a really simple change to merge fruits and vegetables into one category, as opposed to saying you need to eat a certain number of vegetables and they're healthier than fruit, so you balance out how much fruit versus how much vegetable. They've moved to that idea that fruits and vegetables fall within the same category, all of them healthy. So that idea that change can happen nationally and maybe within the nation's best interest, change can happen internationally. And it all depends on the needs. So when we look at healthcare, it goes from the micro level to the biggest macro level. How do we facilitate change? Well, the first thing is to figure out why we need the change. What is necessary? And so when we go back to our example of COVID, and PPE, we need the change because emerging evidence tells us that the way we're doing things may not be safe, right? That what we're doing may not be keeping us safe or our patients safe. to facilitate change, we also need to not just bring it in, say, okay, here's the new way we're doing things. We need to bring in educational activities that enable the recipients of that change in practice or policy or technology are able to acquire the knowledge to be able to master what is required of them. And it's really important that we bring in things like collaboration, facilitation, and problem solving so that the actual change process, it runs smoothly. And so important that we be both flexible and creative in applying change policy, expecting that things will be glitchy, expecting that things may not go as anticipated, and that we need to kind of roll with the punches as they go. Important to recognize that not everybody reacts the same way. Some people love change. Do you ever hear people say that I just love change? I'm an early adopter. I do not love change. I don't even like talking about change. So for me in practice, I change my practice all the time. Evidence, I do love evidence, and that compels me to change, and I love that idea. But I think you have to, I need to understand why I'm making that change, right? And what we all need, what each one of us needs, our basic needs will influence our reaction to that change. If that change leads to a downsizing and nurses being laid off, and I might lose my job, my reaction to that change may be very different than the chief financial officer of the hospital, who is going to see that as beneficial, or somebody who's working in the record department where they determine that they actually need to upsize there. It's so important that all of us need the opportunity to be able to express ourselves openly and freely and to talk about this change, how we are interpreting the change, how it feels to us, what our thoughts are as we about the process that is about to unfold and as it unfolds. We also all need to have that sense that we have some control over it. So how am I not just a victim of this change, but how am I able to actively engage through that change process? And recognize it's okay not to feel great about it. So if there is some sense of loss, and we talked about that, it's important to recognize that it's okay for people to be shocked or angry, and to feel some resistance. And the caveat to that is, hopefully, if it's a good change, if this change is well thought out and necessary, those feelings are the feelings they have at first, but they will not be feelings that persist as the benefits of the change become apparent. It's important to manage change realistically. If we are so full of enthusiasm and we only share the positive side of the change, as opposed to really talking about that change is brought about for a variety of reasons, some of them positive, but some of them, let's say, financial pressures or other things, patient complaints, it's important to talk about that so that people believe and understand that they are being spoken with honestly and openly, and that they have a good understanding of what things are going to look like moving forward. So let's go back to that. Remember, we started to talk about COVID-19 and PPE, and let's apply that experience to three common theories. We're going to talk about Lewin's change theory. That's probably the most common one, and it's amazing. It's 70 years old and fresh as a daisy, still absolutely relevant. We're going to talk about Lippitt's change theory, which is a 7-step. So it's broken down some of those steps a little bit more. And then we're going to talk about transitions theory, and partly that because we want to talk about change, transition, and also we're going to talk a little bit about transformation. So let's talk about Lewin. 3-step model. Can you believe he developed this in 1951? So there have been some revisions, certainly some adaptations, but this model has stood the test of time. And what he says is that change is this dynamic balance between opposing forces. And the driving force for the change, the need for the change. So think about PPE, what was the need for the change? There are a couple of needs for the change. One was the belief that we didn't have enough evidence to know what was keeping us safe. 2 was lack of availability for PPE. Wasn't that one of the driving forces that really caused us to consider what is the best decision-making around efficacy and safety? Because if not everybody can have access to enough PPE, who is at highest risk and who needs to get it? That was a huge driving force, right? And so those driving forces may push employees in a certain direction, may push nurses around PPE in a desired direction. But sometimes you've got other things happening that push you in the opposite direction. So hopefully, when we look at Lewin's change theory, through these 3 steps, and again, this is a change for the better, a positive change that leads to a positive outcome. We are moving towards that change in a positive way. Those forces drive us toward that change, and they oppose the opposite direction. So let's go through those 3 steps. Step 1 is unfreezing. All of us are sort of stuck. We're frozen in the way we do things. And again, think of your patterns. Think of the way you have been working, your processes, how you come into work, how you do things. Really important that we consider sort of we're frozen in time. We're frozen in the way that we do things. And so what we want to do in the first step is to really work at altering our behavior or unfreezing. So we actually want to agitate. We want to shake up the situation. So because we're going to have to shake people out of their everyday complacency. And it's really essential that before we bring about change, we recognize that this unfreezing is necessary and that we need to do that to overcome that sort of conformity, right? We need to do that to overcome whatever barriers we have to change and to move to that new conformity. In step 2, the change stage, we need to involve that movement to that new level. So we've unfrozen where we were at, and now we actually bring about the change in that middle level, and that helps people to see the change from a new perspective. As we move through the change, they're unfrozen, they've got an open mind, and willing to work together to achieve what becomes that new outcome. And then finally, in step 3, we are refreezing. That we move to that new change, the change in behavior, and we freeze ourselves there. And so here's an example, again, going back to that PPE slide. In the first situation, we were frozen in our, for many of us, very conventional understanding of PPE, the conditions under which we used a variety of PPE, and the policies, and those were pretty static across the province for many years. Minor changes, but pretty static. And it was through the recognition of the challenges that we were facing, first of all, a new and emerging situation, and secondly, the driver for that change, remember we talked about that, was the lack of availability. So if we'd had all the PPE we want in the world, the lack of availability of that PPE meant that we had to consider what needed to change to be able to make sure we could keep as many people as safe as we could. And so in stage 1, we did that unfreezing of those old ideas, pointing out that what we knew and what we had thought may not be evidence-based, it was just the way we did it. So there may not have been any evidence to say, for example, you can't re-sterilize a sterile mask. What? All of us, absolutely, for decades, knew that we would take off our sterile N95 mask and discard it. We had all been taught to do that. We all did that absolutely without fail. And in fact, I still continue to think of an N95 that has previously been used as contaminated. Or putting an N95 mask in a paper bag seems to me a poor practice, a dirty practice, because then you're going to reach in what's been in the bag, what's tough. You know, for me, it's all that. And so I have a little bit more unfreezing to do, I guess. Or in the end, maybe it'll prove that that wasn't a good practice. Who knows? But that unfreezing, approach the change. For all of us, that change needed to really be driven by evidence. We needed evidence to feel that that was an appropriate change. For many of us, there wasn't enough evidence there, and I'm not sure how you guys feel, but it sort of felt like we were being driven by money and lack of availability, but not necessarily the evidence that would tell us that we were safe or not safe. And then finally, coming to the refreezing. So what is the new, right? What is the new normal? And really recognizing that there was a set of behaviors that were now entrenched, a set of new policies, a set of new directions, and that's currently where we find ourselves, but that's not where we're always going to find ourselves. So while normally we say we're moving to the new normal, this is what life's going to be like, within the context of COVID-19, I say we move to the new, because I expect there will be more new policies, procedures, evidence as we continue to move forward. So let's use the same example, and now we're going to talk about Lippitt's change theory. And remember, Lewin's change theory was that 3-step: unfreezing, change, refreezing. Lippitt builds on that. And it reminds me of a nursing model, and so that's why I think it's really helpful for us to look at. He built directly on Lewin, and it was just about 7 years later that he published his theory. So he really brought in much more, in a much more direct way, that idea of the change agent. Who is promoting the change, and how are they supporting that change to happen? So in step 1 with Lippitt's theory, we diagnose the problem. We look at all the possible consequences. If we don't change our policies and our protocols in relation to PPE, what's going to happen? Well, the people who may have the greatest exposure may not be the ones who have the PPE required, and the people who don't have that exposure, that intense exposure, may have more PPE than they require. We look at who's affected by the change. There was a lot of people affected by this change, right? So every kind of healthcare worker, the public, and other people. We look at identifying who the people are who have some control over management and making decisions, the people who are responsible for fixing the problem. We make sure that we want to collect the data from that change to really be able to ensure it's evidence-based, and make sure that, that those who are affected by the change, so you and me in terms of PPE, are going to be committed to its success. And for all of us, I think all of us wanted to know we're going to be safe and our patients are going to be safe. So we are committed to its success, but for all of us as well, there needed to be some factors there that would commit me. So I needed to know that I wasn't just going to be doing what someone else said, but in fact, I was part of a process that brought to light important information. In step 2, we want to evaluate our motivation for change, our capability or capacity for change, and we want to look at what kinds of resources are available. Financial resources, so what kind of money could be spent in purchasing PPE, in developing PPE, in funding the research that was necessary, what kind of human resources are essential, and what kind of organizational structure was important. In step 3, we look at the change agent, the person or the entity bringing about the change, their motivation. Why are they bringing it about? Is it just that it serves them, or does it serve the greater good? And do they understand what the greater good is, taking into account all of the stakeholders' perspectives? We want to look at the resources available for change. Change always requires resources, and we're naive to forget that. What is the stamina? Do we have the sticking power? Can we go through this process and get to the end? And how determined are we? How dedicated are we to that? And in particular, the change agent, the person bringing about the change, are they going to be able to hang in through it? We don't want somebody who's going to bring about a change and halfway through say, this is too hard, I'm pooped, I don't want to go on anymore. In step 4, we want to look at what are the objectives for the change. And they are progressive. From the beginning to the end, what are the objectives? And we want to define that change process through those objectives, and then develop an action plan. And that's what we often do in nursing, right? Through understanding our objectives, what is our goal in this situation, develop our action plan, and what is our strategies to bring about the change through that action plan. We really want to explain what is the role of the change agent, the person who's helping to facilitate the change. Is it a PPE monitor that you've implemented on your unit? Is it public health in explaining the situation? Is it, who is the stakeholder that's most responsible? Your infection control expert within your hospital, other people. And you want to ensure that everyone's expectations are clear in terms of what they expect from that change agent, and that the change agent has consistent expectations with the stakeholders. We want to maintain that that change is happening as we provide feedback, right? That change requires constant feedback, excellent communication, and that we're really coordinating everything that's happening. Somebody doesn't come in, tell you what the change is, walk away, and they're never back. And right, so hopefully through this PPE experience in COVID, all of you have seen that there is constant reinforcement, there is constant updates, there's an opportunity to speak with people and move through that process. And as we get to the end of that change and that restabilization, that we gradually terminate the relationship with the change agent. We don't need that change agent to continue to be there once the change has happened and it's stabilized. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the Spradley model, which is a model of transition, talks about transition versus change. It still is based on Lewin's theory. And so again, you see how the value of Lewin's theory, and it continues to move through those a stepwise fashion, in this case 8. So step one, we recognize the symptoms. Now that's starting to sound familiar, isn't it? That sounded like Lippitt, doesn't it? We diagnose in Lippitt, we recognize the symptoms in the Spradley model. After we recognize the symptoms, this sounds like familiar language, we diagnose the problem. Okay, so the symptom was people weren't able to find PPE. All of the hospitals were calling their suppliers. The suppliers didn't have enough available. There was a lack of a variety of different kinds of PPE. And so the problem was a failure of supply chains to be able to provide the amount of PPE that was required, and in particular, N95 masks. We need to look at the alternative solutions. So are there other suppliers? Is there a different supply chain? So China had been a great supplier of N95 masks in particular, but that supply chain was broken at this point. So were there other suppliers? Could we make them in Canada? We did move to some of that, but it was not enough to solve the whole problem, was it? And so another one of those solutions was that we had to really define what kind of PPE was needed in each situation so that we could prioritize which healthcare provider had which kind of PPE available to them and under what circumstances they could use it, and for the duration, right? How long could they use it for? And so when we look at step number 4, selecting the change actually required several things. So it did require that we looked for other supply chains, and we started making masks and other PPE in Canada. We called into service a lot of different kinds of companies to make cloth gowns and other things. It did require that we look at availability of PPE, how we prioritize who needs it, what is the evidence about transmission, what is the evidence about re-sterilizing, what is the evidence about the circumstances under which you need a surgical gown versus an N95, when do you need goggles versus, or a face shield versus not, do we need caps? We're still kind of out in the, up in the air about do we need caps, nursing caps or hospital caps. So for many of us, that's an old idea that they actually, nursing caps became outdated. I think the last nursing school in Ontario to actually require nursing caps was in the late 60s, it might have been 1971, that the last graduating class that required nursing caps graduated. So it's a long time, 50 years since nurses have routinely worn them, although every once in a while you see a nurse with a cap. Those caps were more decorative, and I apologize to anyone I might be offending, or anyone's mother or grandmother or anybody else, aunt, that I might be offending, but they had less to do with actual protection. Now we see through COVID that concern that potentially we become contaminated, we're carrying that virus on us in our clothes and our hair, and we see nurses moving to wear caps in a different kind of way, a cloth cap. And sometimes those surgical caps, you know, with the elastic around and that. The question is, what's the evidence that's guiding us in that decision making? I think that evidence is really kind of up in the air still a bit, and so we'll have to see. So we looked at the change, and there were a lot of changes that happened, sort of all at the same time, and that made it a very murky change process and a very challenging one because so many changes happened at once. Within each of those changes, so we've got the overall change, which is a change to safety and protection, right? The use of PPE. But within that, there was a variety of changes that had to happen, and making determinations about how each one has to happen. And for each one of those changes, we needed to plan that change. After the planning, we need to implement the change. This is starting to sound a lot like nursing, right? After implementing the change, we need to evaluate the change. And then after evaluating the change, I'm going to come back to Lippitt and Lewin, we stabilize the change. So Lewin said we freeze, we refreeze. Lippitt uses different language. And finally here in Spradley, and I'm sorry about that's not on a separate line, but number 8 is we stabilize the change. What I would say is why COVID-19 and PPE is such a great example is because we're sort of stabilized right now, but I expect now, even after I'm talking today, you will continue to see changes unfolding over the next year, and it'll be interesting to watch with new eyes at the change process, not just the regulation that's coming down, but the change process as it unfolds. So a couple of words about the process of managing change. And look at this, we all know this process: assessment, planning, implementation, and evaluation, nursing process. So when we look at assessment, it's the same as you would do in nursing. We want to identify what's the problem or what's the opportunity for change. We want to collect the data that's necessary. Same as you would collect data on an individual patient. We want to collect the data on the problem here at a larger level. And we want to recognize what are the forces that are driving the change And what are the forces that are resisting the change? In the planning phase, remember that's the unfreezing phase, we want to know what are we targeting for that change? Who are the people and the systems involved? And we want to bring together a team that has the best knowledge, best detailed understanding and insight into those systems involved. We want to create the process for change. And we want to establish what is the timeline for change and how are we going to get feedback as we move through that change to be able to evaluate the progress as we move through. We don't wait till the very end of that change process to get feedback, because we'll be well beyond opportunities to be able to engage and realize that we might be doing things differently. We look to the implementation phase as the third phase. And in the implementation phase, we've done assessment, we've done planning, and now we initiate the plans that we've set in place. We create that supportive network. We make sure people have the right information. Think about that with PPE, provide training. Think about that with PPE. We make sure that we have key stakeholders who are supporting that change. And what I would say is, in the midst of the change, and it was happening so fast, and it was driven sometimes just by context as opposed to best evidence, we didn't always, through COVID-19 PPE challenges, have all the stakeholders at the table and all the stakeholders in agreement. I think for a lot of us as nurses and other kinds of healthcare providers, we weren't always in agreement, and we felt powerless about a change that was happening around us. It's really critical that we actually value the participants' input and we respond to it. And it also is important that the people who are part of that team have authority. They have the authority to take action. So if people who are there gathering feedback or part of the change are just following someone else's orders, it's completely ineffective. They need to be able to respond to feedback. They need to actually be able to make the change. They need to have the authority to make that change. And they need to be able to recognize where conflict is happening and respond to it. And to make, and to really provide rewards or provide support when we see those behaviors that we're looking for as part of the change process happening. And then the final phase, evaluation, or the refreezing phase. And in that, we want to look at what are the indicators of the change, and is this what we anticipated would happen? We want to look at how effective that change has been, and we want to, again, stabilize that change. So move to that place of stabilization. And I'm just going to move, just honestly, for a couple of minutes to talk about transformative learning. So we've talked about change. That last model talked about transition as opposed to just specifically change. But now I want to talk about transformation. And in nursing, we really focus on a model of learning called transformative learning. And you had a reading about this. This was what's called a concept development. It looked to say what is, so we're talking about transformative learning all the time. We believe that is our goal, that learning is not just taking in facts, memorizing details, using other people's knowledge and accepting it at face value, learning what other people want me to learn as opposed to what I think might be important. That transformative learning changes us as human beings. And so here's the definition after looking at all of the literature on transformative learning and using a very scientific method for what's called a concept analysis of determining what is transformative learning. And so this definition isn't just this one author's definition or the definition from one study or from one book. She looked at a massive amount of literature and came up with what is the consensus definition. And what she found was that transformative learning is a contextual, so the context matters, cyclic, which means it's iterative. We move through a variety of changes, and highly cognitive, so it's a thinking process, and affective, emotional process that affects a mental shift. Oh my gosh, these are so many words. So let's go back again. It's contextual, the context matters in transformative learning. It's cyclical, right? So it doesn't just happen today. Today I'm not transformed. It goes through an iterative process over and over again, exploring myself, exploring the world, exploring the situation. We think deeply, we feel deeply, and we shift our mindset. And that happens with meaningful interaction, integrating ideas from a variety of different perspectives, and a democratic process where we hear everyone's voice. Right? So it's not just one person's ideas, it's everyone coming together. It's that having a dialogue together. And that allows us to come to new insights, and it allows us to change our perspective. So when we're thinking about nursing education, it's very easy to come in and think, oh, I know I'm going to learn more skills, and I know I'm going to learn a lot more about microbiology, or I'm going to learn a lot more about how procedures are done, or what is the best science related to a variety of conditions, hypertension, other things. Transformative learning asks that you engage personally as an individual with that information, and that it comes from multiple perspectives. Let's say you're looking at hypertension. We look at what is medical information, what is biophysical information, what is pharmacological information. We also look at what are the theories with which we approach life and lifestyle and life meaning, what matters to people. We look at the experiences of people with hypertension. We go to a much deeper level so that you can really reconstruct how you, not how I'm telling you, but how you approach that concept. And often that process of transformative learning is uncomfortable. And it's, remember, so we talked about some of these change theories where it's shake it up, you shake it up to get things going. None of this changes if we're in steady state and happy. Change happens when we start to feel uncomfortable. We're exposed to new ideas, and we start to really toss and turn those ideas over, and we feel uncomfortable. And we look at the world around us and how we see that world. And these new ideas cause us to really expand our awareness and to reflect deeply as people on what we're seeing, what we're feeling, how the world is unfolding in particular situations, what is the context. And this whole process advances the development of what we call the metacognition. So that's not just my knowledge of one thing. It is my view of how everything fits together. So transformative learning is not about learning facts. It's about integrating the new knowledge into how I see the world and my place in it and how I choose to engage with it. And that makes us more independent. That makes us have greater authority within the world. And it also helps us to really work towards a world that is much more socially just and interestingly more globally competitive. The more we are autonomous, all of us, and individual thinkers, and contemplative and reflective, the more we all bring each other forward, which leads to greater success, greater depth of thinking, greater problem-solving capacity. So what do we know about transformative learning? That, again, it's that uncomfortable situation that triggers it. And in that uncomfortable situation, often we experience a dilemma that feels disorienting. Wait, you're telling me something new, but I always thought something different, and I felt very comfortable where I was at. And it's that discomfort and that new exposure, meeting your old perceptions and beliefs and life experiences that can challenge how you view the world and your place in it. And so when we look at the three phases that happen in transformative learning, that phase one is that expanded awareness. So we begin to reflect on these new ideas and what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing and what I'm engaging in, and we just reflect deeply. So it's not just I'm taking it in and memorizing, Sukhothi said this, Leslie Graham said this, but instead it's that I'm reflecting on these ideas. I'm mulling them over, I'm turning them around in my own head. In phase two, that's where we really think deeply and feel deeply. And it moves us to that, in that mental shift, not just that I absorb new knowledge, but mentally, I move to a different place around something. And that's a very meaningful process that involves sort of that interactive with other individuals, with myself and the information, that we integrate a variety of sources and experiences, feelings and thoughts. And again, that it is it's not forced upon us, it's a very democratic process. I choose to engage in this. And that leads to that new insight and a changed perspective. The kinds of things that really facilitate that phase two and being successful is that ability to investigate a variety of learning activities. So you'll see that not all your courses have multiple choice tests, not all your courses are what you may have experienced before. There's opportunity for discovery, there's opportunity to look for evidence, and it needs to be research-based. So guess what? In your BSCN program, there is a lot of discovery, not just me giving you the facts. There's me giving you a reading, or other professors giving you readings and asking you to really explore that material, think about that material, reflect on it in relation to what you know. It's not just about me pointing to what is important. It's about you making a determination about what does this mean to you. Finding evidence is going to be really critical, and you're going to see that research courses required, literature searches, and really learning to critically appraise information is really important. Collaborative learning activities are really critical for transformative learning. Communication, working in groups, learning to communicate really effectively, sort of verbally, and I know all of you are effective that way, learning to communicate through written means, both informally in sort of your group posts and other things, and also formally through scholarly writing, and developing that sense of connection with yourself, that internal sense of connection with each other, connection beyond that with your patients and their families and all of that. Interactive learning is essential. You're going to see lots of group work, and you're going to see lots of class activities. And often in those, we may do what's called Socratic questioning, or a dialogue that happens. So it's a conversation. And the goal isn't that everyone agrees at all, or that you agree with the professors. The goal is that you, again, take in that information, mull it over, think about it, reflect on it, ask questions. It's really important that we take part in that, those higher order thinking skills. So that critical reflection, take imaginative and creative approaches to different situations, and that you be innovative, find solutions that aren't there. You know, the expectation is not that you stick with the tried and true. The expectation is that you try on a whole bunch of new things. And that finally we really approach this kind of thinking with a philosophical and theoretical base. Next year, you're going to take Knowing Through Inquiry and Nursing Theories course that will bring some of that forward. The ethics course brings some of that forward. And within your other courses, there's a focus on a variety of theories that help to guide the structure of thinking that really supports you as you move through transformative learning. And then phase 3, remember I talked about that metacognition. And metacognition isn't that I just understand something or I know it. It's that higher level of I know this fact, this information within the context of everything that I hold within myself. My knowing, my feeling, my being in relation to the world, this information or this evidence, who I see myself as and who I see others as. And one of the things that's really important in metacognition is this idea that I drive my own learning. So it's not just what someone is telling me to learn, not that I won't, you know, a professor may say these are the course outcomes and this is what the requirements are, and I could expect that I might be tested on that material. But the goal is to also say beyond what the professor is talking about, there are things that I choose to learn from this material that may not be about what somebody else is choosing, but that's important to me. And just a couple, so we talked about what those are that's the definition of transformative learning and the characteristics. But what needs to be in place in order for transformative learning to happen? So we look at those, that's the antecedents, what needs to be in place. We need to be able to look at things from both a thinking and a feeling perspective. And so often we'll come back to that. How do you feel about this, and ask you to reflect on it. There need to be what's called democratic educational principles. It's not just one-way communication. We talk often in conversation, and we work collaboratively together, and we need to be inspired and motivated and feel some connection with what we're learning. And what are the outcomes? So if those are the antecedents, what's necessary for transformative learning to occur? What happens as a result of transformative learning? The results are pretty magnificent. Transformative learning leads to autonomous thinking citizens. We think for ourselves. Now, we might all think we always thought for ourselves. And there's a difference between stubbornness and thinking. Many of you may already be autonomous thinkers. But what we know is transformative learning absolutely directs us to that I think for myself, not in a stubborn way, but in a way that allows me to understand new information within the context of other information that I know, what I've seen, what I've experienced, what I feel, what I believe, all of those things. It leads to a change in perspective, a transformation in perspective, how I see the world, how I see a certain situation, how I see a certain context or conundrum. And do you remember I said before, it allows us to be more competitive on the global market. Often as nurses, we don't think about that. But what's fascinating is that many of you will have heard this expression that Canadian nurses are welcome anywhere. We are so highly valued internationally because we are so, we are considered such excellent thinkers and presenting ourselves with such deep caring and at the same time such exquisite skill. That idea of becoming that autonomous thinker and at the same time having that recognized not only in ourselves but externally through that recognition of our practice. And then finally, an interesting phenomenon here is that transformative learning, as we grow and we learn and we are able to bring all of that new knowledge, new understanding, be able to look at the world in different places, it really does lead to a more just world. It causes us to look not only at ourselves, but at the fairness or the justice in the world. And all of us know there's a lot that's going on right now when we look at Black Lives Matter, a lot of other things. We look at through COVID, even poverty and food insecurity. Understanding that learning is transformative and going through that process of transformative learning opens us up to an understanding of how justice is so essential for the world around us. And so it's pretty phenomenal. And so a little bit of a warning as you move through the program that a lot of times students in year one say, hey, wait a second, this isn't what I expected. And I don't see why this is important. What we found in our research was that often in year two, students said, okay, fine. I don't know whether it's important or not, but I'm not going to resist it. I'll do what you say because I think in the end, you're probably right. And by year three, students had moved through this transformative learning experience to such a degree that they were saying, that's fine. What you want is fine, but I really care what I am doing with this information or this new knowledge. Who I am as the knowledge holder is the critical component. And that is the very heart of transformation. And that is it. I hope that was interesting for you. I look forward to continuing to chat as we move through the course. And I hope all of you continue to stay well and stay safe.